in this endeavor is to make you ask and answer uncomfortable questions and make uncomfortable decisions.
I accept that we have to make difficult decisions, but I'm trying to say we need a set of data and a decision framework that gets us as comfortable as we can in making uncomfortable decisions. I'm not yet there that's what we've done, because we have so many different competing time frames. And I guess my question is, would it be unreasonable, in your opinion, for me as a board member in looking at this to make my decisions based on what for the four of these, ignoring what their description is, what the expected return and standard deviation is over the shortest period of time that you're looking at, basically 5 years? Would that be an unreasonable way to look at this?
Yes, that would be unreasonable. And you have, for all intents and purposes, a perpetuity. And the assets will be involved, absent the pay-as-you-go issue. And the challenge is that you have very long-term liabilities and you have some assets that have very long-term lives. And if you look at too narrow of a framework, it so reduces the opportunity set, because the shorter the time frame, the wider the distribution of returns, that you end up with a portfolio that doesn't have a linkage to the liability stream. And so we use a 10-year number. And we've repetitively told this board and all our other clients that we, along with, in our opinion, the rest of the investment community, has very limited ability to forecast the future. And that's why these issues are revisited on a regular basis. The different time frames, for example, number 4, the only way to deal with drawdown risk is over a short period of time, because it will have long-term consequences. So are there different time frames? The answer is unequivocally yes. And where we would come out, Mr. Rosensteel, is we think there should be multiple time frames, that you have a multi-period problem that you're trying to solve, and using one time frame for every variable would give you suboptimal results.
So I can look at 10 years.
You may.
Okay, thank you.
You have permission from Mr. Emkin.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Paul. Michael?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on Paul's line of questioning. So can you kind of talk about the decisions that are made over the next 3 years, how they become sort of, how easy they are to move away from 3 years from now if we're kind of revisiting this? My prior question, you basically said 3 years ago the allocation with the 17% was something that shouldn't even have been in there because the board had no control over. So you've kind of already dismissed the work that was done 3 years ago in terms of one of their key factors. So can you kind of talk about 3 years from now, how much the decisions we make now will sort of prohibit or close doors off 3 years from now?
Okay. Historically, for this board and almost every other board that I've ever worked with, asset allocation moves glacially. It does not move in rapid moves, particularly when you're looking at an asset base of $160 billion. You don't lightly wake up one day and say you're going to move 20% of that out of one asset class into another asset class. Particularly some of the asset classes, specifically real estate and private equity, are constrained. And that is, you do not have the ability to put, in quote, 100% of the assets in any one of those. And the big decision ends up, to what extent do you want to move within those assets where you have the ability to shift? And there, historically, that's been done incrementally. And this is an iterative process, and it is not a process which is unrelated to the one that went before it or the one that will come after it. And so, in our opinion, what has happened with most clients is they become either slightly more conservative, slightly more aggressive, or slightly more diversified, depending upon the opportunity set at any given point in time. And I think your observation is really quite excellent in terms of cost should not have been a decision factor 3 years ago. I think that's right on the money. It shouldn't have been, since it's something this board has no control over. But in fact, that was not an independent variable. There were 4 other items which allowed the board to have input. And in fact, as you've seen, as Mr. Rosenstiel pointed out, it's one that doesn't have much of an impact because you don't control it.
So, given kind of the incremental change, the scenarios you're bringing to us today, how quickly do you kind of view moving from today's to one of these 4? What's the time to get to sort of, okay, we're now at the...
Depending upon the changes you would choose, the odds are most of them would be significantly completed, if not completely completed, by the time the next asset allocation study was undertaken. Recognizing that the most difficult parts of the capital markets to move into and out of are the ones that are most constrained by the model, so you don't end up with an unimplementable solution.
And Alan, I would add, Michael, we'll come back, depending on how significant it changes from the status quo, we would come back with an implementation plan. You, in essence, are setting new targets. We don't chase the targets, we're investors, so we would look at it opportunistically, and if we can get there quickly because it's public markets, we would make the shift sometimes very quickly. We have the ability to move about $1 billion seamlessly in the market at a very low cost and without market impact. But as Alan said, in the private markets areas, those take a considerable period of time. And a good example would be inflation sensitive. The board added that as an asset class last time for the 5% allocation. If you notice, we're still only at about 0.6. Most of that is infrastructure, which takes a long time when we don't want to buy rapidly. And then the other would be inflation-sensitive bonds, which have a negative yield. We actually owned a couple of billion, but sold them. So we'll be investors and tactically shift around this. I always say it's a long-term target. We're a big cruise ship. You pick a target on the horizon. We'll steer towards that and make subtle shifts depending on the weather and the environment we see.
Good, Michael? All right, Tom.
Thank you. This is I apologize if this is ground that's been covered before I joined the board, but one thing I'm having difficulty as I look at the cases and is between DF1 and DF3, what are the analytical differences or what are the strategic differences that we're looking at there?
Decision factor 3 is just a pure measurement of compound mean return.
Right.
So it is, in a way, independent of the liabilities of the plan. Decision factor 1 is not. In decision factor 1, we compare the funded ratio.
Okay, I'm with you.
Okay.
Good, Tom. Okay. All right.
Okay, can we get the model up at this point? Okay, here's the live model that's on my screen here. And you'll notice that there's the decision factors Neil spoke of. We'll be putting in folks' votes in here. In this particular case, what we have said is that we're going to put 100% of our chips into decision factor 3. So all we care about is return.
Bob, as you say that, for the board members, if it's on your screen and small, it's very hard to see. I believe it's Control C.
Click on that image and then hit Control
Right click and
Enter.
There we go. So right click on the image, Control Enter, it will fill your whole screen, be a little bit more readable. Go ahead, Bob. Sorry.
No, thank you. That's great. I'd like to call your attention to this graph down here. This is the traditional efficient frontier graph where we have risk as measured by standard deviation of return along the horizontal axis and average compound return, both measured over 10 years on the vertical axis. This kind of cloud in here is about 54,000 portfolios that we included in our search set. The diamond, the little triangle here is the current policy where that sits in that group of return and risk. And this is the best portfolio according to the weighting of decision factors we put into this particular set, which is 100% on return. Now, you notice that the current policy is not on the efficient frontier. That's probably because the capital market assumptions have changed since that policy was adopted. You'll notice that the best portfolio selected by the model is up here. It is one of the most aggressive portfolios available because you've said all you care about is return. Now, on the other hand, let's suppose that all you care about is avoiding a major 2-year drawdown. If I put that in here and I compute, we now notice that the best portfolio mix has changed and the portfolio is all the way down here. Very conservative. And then one more example is if I don't care about that, but I do care about avoiding pay-go risk. And then we get to Paul's point, which is now we're right back up to the top. So what the model is telling you is that under the current situation, your only real chance of improving your ability to avoid pay-go is really by being quite aggressive. We'll see in a minute that there's actually ways to make it much easier to get pay-go by choices you can make, that you have increase your chances of pay-go. This graph here is for the next 40 years on the horizontal axis, and it shows the probability of pay-go as it changes over time. And this is your current portfolio here in red. And we can see that over 40 years, you have more than a 70% chance of becoming a pay-as-you-go system.
I have a question from Rich.
Yeah.
Can you back up a slide?
Yes, I can. There?
Okay, so I've been having a hard time with the 4 boxes approach too. If I wanted to, in the efficient frontiers portion, if I just wanted to slide up the current policy to the top of the efficient frontier, right? It's a little low, if I'm reading that right, in the middle, sort of in the blue. If I wanted to just go straight up,
Right.
how would I do that? How would I, in terms of the allocation boxes? Because that's where I have to vote. If I just wanted to, let's say this was my tolerance for risk, right? Somewhere along the top of that line is where my gut says how much risk we should take. You with me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to go due north, and I wanted to move up. How would I know what the split is?
You don't, that's an interesting question. In mathematics, it's referred to as an inverse problem. How do you get, what parameters do you change to get to the results you want to
There
change?
is a
I call it
portfolio
reverse
that matches
engineering.
that, right?
Yes, reverse engineering.
Right, there's a portfolio that matches that.
There is a portfolio up there, but it may actually not be one that you would get to by a weighting of the different decision factors.
Then what good does the decision factors do me?
The decision factors express the risk in terms that you live with, in terms of the returns you're experiencing, the funded ratio you have. That's what the decision factors are. Standard deviation of return is risk only to somebody that doesn't have to worry about what the assets are used for. So here we're combining assets and liabilities in selecting the best portfolio. Now, you'll notice that
But at
we've
the end
almost...
of the day, I don't invest in those 4 boxes. I invest in things on the ground, right? I either invest in private equity, or I invest in one of the other real estate, or I invest in one of the other categories. I don't invest in those boxes. I invest in actual things. So this is part, I've had this confusion about this, which is, especially when 2 of the groups come out with more or less the same thing. It's
I
like,
think the thing is just answer it. I think we can find that portfolio for you, and I'd say, play around with the allocations between 3 and 4, toggle them back and forth, and we can do that for you if you would like us to do that, until we get that red box above the triangle. We're pretty close here with an equal, you can see here, we're pretty close here with an equal weighting across the different risk factors.
you get pretty close.
Pretty close.
But I think
But-
the key here it's really conceptual. And that is using just the two variables, risk and return. You're right, you can go up and down in terms of where those little lines are. The challenge is the industry has said that that doesn't really address the concerns of someone who's trying to manage a portfolio that includes liabilities and it has costs associated with it. It just looks at the very simple risk and return equation. And risk, the goal of this exercise is to expand how risk is perceived so you incorporate those different types of risk into the decision-making process.
And just to add on to that, the classic risk and return chart that you're seeing in the lower left-hand side, which you're all used to, that's the expected return that you're going to have at the end of a horizon and the variation around that return at the end of the horizon. It says nothing about your experience during the horizon. So if you want to have that kind of, express that kind of issue, what's going to happen during the horizon, you start weighting risk factor 4, because it's a short-term horizon type of consideration that you may care about in this system, that if you have another bear market blow up, the system's out of business. But you may not. But that's how, going to Alan's point, the risk on the horizontal axis on the lower left-hand side is probably the most simplistic notion of risk that you could have. And we're trying to bring a little bit more color to the risk notions with the 4 boxes instead of having one measure.
Good, Rich?
Let me just show a couple of other issues.
I've got a couple questions still in the queue here. Michael? Hey, wait 1 second. There we go.
Actually, just to follow up on that comment, is another way of expressing your concern that kind of the re-engineering process, you could do the re-engineering process and then say, in order to get here, here are the things that you're giving up. And here are the things that are going to be potential problems if that's where you want to go. And what we're doing is kind of the other way around. Where do you want to go? How do you want to get there? And here's what that will, because that's the way I'm trying to rationalize this, because this has been kind of a struggle for me as well. Because my natural inclination is kind of the same thing. Say, where is it that we want to go? We want to get to, high return, low risk, which is virtually impossible. And so in order to, so another way of doing this same exercise, and maybe it's a subset of the analysis that you do for us, is wherever you end up, wherever we end up, we're going to want to tweak it.
Yes.
And each tweak
Absolutely.
is going to have an impact on the risk factor, or on these 4 boxes. So I think it would help us, and I know it would help me, if you'd be prepared to discuss that as well as you can in this context.
Sure. As we go through the process a couple of times, we'll see where we end up. I mean, the basic theme that comes out of these asset allocations, we're showing you some scenarios here, like on, I think it was slide 12, just to give you a feel for what, I'm sorry, that's toggling back. Bear with me for a second as I just scroll back. It's on slide 11. Okay. We're just showing you, these are extreme outcomes if the investment committee placed all its, which is not going to happen, all its chips on this one or all its chips on this one. These are how the asset potential could swing. Going to Mr. Rosenthal's point, absent decision factor 4, these things are sort of really bunched together, right? So that the allocation differences may not be as dramatic as we think they are. So just keep that in mind too as we walk. And where are the changes? The changes come in fixed income, where almost you can see your current policy allocation is 21%. You can see here that no matter which risk tolerance, which risk box you're picking and how much you're placing on it, it's saying drop fixed income. Okay, that's one theme that comes out. You can see that There is a little play on real estate. Real estate bounces around, but it's sort of pushing that 11 to 13 number. So you can sort of expect that's probably where we're going to end up. And almost no matter what decision factor you pick, private equity is maxed out as well. And then there's a little bit of trade-off between the inflation link class. That can go anywhere from 0 to 7 with the trade-off of public equity. So that's what's going on, and that's what you're going to see as you begin to express your weightings.
I've got a question from Tom.
Yeah, one question, and again, forgive me if I'm covering ground that is old, but one of the interesting things in all these scenarios, and if you go back to the chart you had where you can place all your chips on one or the other, here, and it shows the efficient frontier, is that almost none of the solutions show us maxing out at the 7.5% level that we seem to be assuming as a rate of return for the portfolio and a discount rate. And my question is, why shouldn't we be centering around that target rate of return and evaluating risk relative to it, as opposed to risk this is a variant, I think, on Paul's question and Michael's question, as opposed to risk in one context, and then, oh, okay, now that we've identified a risk profile, how do you, stretching to find a return?
This is the classic chicken and the egg. And that is, and you can I defer to the actuary, but in fact, the expected return is a residual. It's not something you solve for. It's going to be based upon what's available in the marketplace at any given point in time. And in today's world, given low real interest rates and low expected return for equities, to get to 7.5 or 8%, you would have to assume a level of volatility that most people would say is unreasonable for a large institutional investor.
So even if we went 100%, that was my question, if you switch to 100% one, I think we still come short of that 7.5%.
Yes, and another reason is, and these are on INV 36 in the appendix,
Yeah.
is through the dialogue of the process, you have constraints around these classes. So you can only go so far in terms of the return you're going to get, because you can only put so much in a particular class. You've constrained
So
yourself.
it's our asset
There's sort
allocations.
of implementation considerations around the classes also.
The classic example, which I know you're familiar with, is private equity, and the system can't put $40 or $50 billion into private equity, nor into real estate in a prudent and thoughtful manner. And so that's constrained, which really leaves the residual to be moving primarily between stocks and bonds, but to a certain extent inflation-linked assets.
I guess one thing you can do, there's another display. If I just go to the returns display here, this might be a little confusing to look at. In each case, we have a rectangle that shows a distribution of returns, and the actual level of return is shown in the numbers. In each rectangle, we have current and best at 1 years, 5 year, 10, 20, and 30 years. And these are the compound returns over that period of time. The bottom number is the 5th percentile. Then this is the 90th percentile, 75th percentile, median in red there. 75th percentile, 90th percentile. If I got that confused, I'm sorry, I apologize. So this is the top 95th, 90th, 75th, median, and so forth on down the line. You can see here that putting 100% of our weight on funding significantly, in every case, increases the spread of possible returns, and no matter how far out you go. And you'll notice that spread decreases over time just because you've got a longer averaging period going on. You'll notice as well that in the long run, you are indeed out below 7.46%, is the median return out 30 years, median compound return out 30 years, which is telling you that you have to be very, very aggressive in your portfolio in order to make your actuarial assumption on a compound basis, which should be part of the discussion of where the actuarial assumption should be. You know, but again, this is, somebody will counter that by saying that, remember that PCA is making their assumptions and Chris is making his assumptions on sort of a 10-year time horizon, not a 30-year time horizon. And the standard consensus among actuaries is that you should be looking out long-term, where, of course, we know better what'll happen out in 30 years than we do what'll happen for the next 10. But that's another subject.
You good, Tom?
Okay, that's helpful.
Just,
Yeah, I'm not, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
we also have a similar graph for cost, which is a little interesting here. You notice that this is the statutory cost.
Before we go on to cost, can I ask a follow-up question on the returns?
Can I
Okay,
finish?
go ahead, go
Let me
ahead.
finish the cost
Sure.
slide and we'll come back to your turn. This is kind of interesting. You'll notice that the cost goes along at the statutory level until you get out about 20 years, in which case it pops up. What's going on here? Those pop-up points occur where you run out of money. And the legislature has to directly appropriate benefit payments. So these are the actual pay-as-you-go costs of the plan out here, once you've run out of money. And Paul, back to your returns.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I appreciate what you were just showing, and I think that's kind of summarized on INV 77, 79, 81, 83, which shows by percentile distributions what the likelihood of the compound return is over 1 year, 5 year, 10, 20, and 30 years. But all of the, except for number 4, all of these scenarios get us roughly to our 7.5% in 10 years and in 30 years, if you're assuming the median return. The median return for number 1 is 7.4% in 10 years and 7.5% in 30 years. And for number 2, it's 7.5 and then 7.6. And because number 2 and number 3 are identical, again, 7.5 and 7.6. So we're only really being presented with options here, other than number 4, that get us to our 7.5% in 10 years or in 30 years. And so I'm curious as to why you said the only way to get there is with an aggressive portfolio, because that's really all we've been given here. And are we describing these as aggressive portfolios, or I'm confused here.
Decision factors at the top are not the portfolios, and you're not going to weight them at 100%. You'll weight them at something. So you would, to get your 7.5%, you would have to say, I want a portfolio that gives me the highest return possible, number 3, for example, and I don't care about anything else.
But I could get to
And-
But I could get to 7.5% by choosing 100% scenario 2,
That's right.
which
you
is
could.
a conservative scenario.
Well, it's not necessarily, well, in this case, because of statutory funding, it is not a conservative scenario.
Okay, so we really only have one conservative scenario, and that one says that the likelihood over 10 years is a 5.9% return, and over 30 years is a 6% return.
That's a fair statement, Paul.
Okay.
Yep.
And
Because of the structural
Right.
thing you've been facing.
So our median is lower, our upside is lower, our downside is lower. In other words, the likelihood.
With,
The likelihood-
with decision factor 4, that's
with the-
correct.
Right, so
Yep.
that in 10 years, the 5th percentile is a 0.6% return. But in number 3, it's a minus 0.6. Number 2 is minus 0.6 again.
Yeah.
And in number 1, it's a minus 1.3.
But Paul, keep in mind that the override on the level of conservatism is the minimums and maximums in the model. It's not allowed to go to
Yeah.
zero equity
Yeah.
or more
Right.
than X amount in
Right,
fixed
so we're
income.
constrained in
Yeah.
that.
And that is
are we
what's
constrained on fixed income?
There's a max. What was the max?
There's constraint, there, I mean, it's in the appendix, there,
Just asking, is there a min, is there a max? I
it's
guess
very wide,
Okay,
very wide.
okay, so
Probably
we don't
50%.
bump up against the minimum or the maximum?
We do
in
bump
any of
up
these?
against the minimum.
The model
Because-
wouldn't solve for any fixed income unless you went to number 4, because returns are so low.
Yeah.
I see, okay, okay, so there is a minimum of 15, which is
Yes.
Right.
why we're seeing 15.
A max of 49.
Got it, thank you.
Yeah. And even under, I mean, that's interesting, even under decision factor 4, which is the most conservative, you didn't get the max in fixed income. So fixed income, you had like 35 or 39%, something like that. So it threw a lot in fixed income, but it's even saying, if that's your concern, downside risk, you know, you even need to blend some other stuff with the fixed income to help you out.
Okay, so I really hope that you can make some progress today. And I think the best way to do it is for Bob to work with you, showing you some of these models on what you get, so you give us the proper direction.
Well, do people have enough information now for you folks to express, you know, to begin to throw some percentages under your name? And we need to put Mr. Cohen's name in there. It's not in there. So maybe where Harry's name is, maybe put Michael's name in there.
And Michael has a.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think what you're getting is a fair bit of skepticism on the model, and so plugging percentages in is going to be very hard. I mean, you kind of made the comment, well, we can't predict the future, but you've got a model that basically thinks it can, and so it's problematic to me to basically, when you've got a model that is going to on the natural lead you to aggressive scenarios because it can predict the future, and so it's almost. I mean, I see you shaking your head. You feel free to argue on behalf of the model, but it ultimately, I mean,
Well-
you are guiding us to a much more aggressive strategy based on the model.
That's not true. Okay, first of all, if the whole board wanted to weight decision factor 4, if you wanted to, Mr. Moore, Cohen, Lawson, on down the line, everybody got together and put 100% weight on decision factor 4, you'd have an incredibly conservative portfolio. So there's a range there. But to your point, probably that's not how the weighting's going to go. And I gave you sort of those themes. So it's probably going to be pretty close to your current policy. That's probably what's going to end up happening. So, but you can dictate that. We don't come in here with a portfolio in mind. You're going to dictate where the portfolio goes depending on how you weight these things.
Your model is dictating where we go based on the numbers, based on its sort of past its prologue, presuming that it knows the future and it knows that equity investments will be better, and so the model is clearly driving us that direction.
That's correct. There are assumptions in the model, and those assumptions are going to drive the allocations.
And
That's
just
correct.
Part of that, let me jump in, Michael, is you're catching us at the end, as we call it, step 7. Back in February, we went through capital market assumptions. We had a couple of different presentations about what should we assume, but you're right, we have to look at the past because we do not have a crystal ball to the future. That was a key input to the model. And then in April, we worked with the board to actually pick these decision factors. And rightly or wrongly, we intended that there would be 2 risk-focused ones and 2 return-focused ones. We did not realize back in April or in June, when we looked at the pay-as-you-go number 2, that it was indifferent risk and return. The intent was to have a full set, so that you had 2 risk and 2 return-focused.
And
But the board picked these decision
sure,
factors.
and I apologize.
in our
You know,
work.
several of us are jumping in at the end, and so I can imagine that's a little frustrating for you. But it does. I mean, even with sort of your comment, we ended up with 3 aggressive scenarios. That sort of reiterates the notion that the model is
But you get to decide
guiding us this way.
you get to decide how to weight those.
Right, but it's
So-
just when we weight, if we weight it more conservatively, you're going to be telling us that
The portfolio is not going to produce a very high long-term return.
That's right.
That's right.
Right.
But that's
But that's based upon, rightfully or wrongfully, our expectations, the representations to the board, broad industry consensus, because anyone in our industry who looked at these numbers would say they're reasonable. They never say they're right. I just want to be,
No, I get that, but you dismissed Paul's notion of looking at sort of a relatively short time horizon, but yet your short time horizons in your charts again point to that scenario one, the model spitting out, well, it's going to be a 12.5% return on average. So it's
you see, I don't think I dismissed it at all. Matter
No,
of
we
fact,
did
what
not dismiss it.
I would do is strongly encourage those people who are concerned about that issue as part of this process to weight heavily the one item that directly addresses that, which is decision 4, which is specifically there to address that concern.
Yeah.
But I thought I heard you say that basically the 1 and 5 year are subject to so great uncertainty that Paul shouldn't be really looking at, and that that you were looking at the 10 year.
No, it wasn't that he shouldn't be concerned about that. And the way to express that concern is by weighting decision 4. What I was saying is that we don't make a 5-year forecast or a 3-year forecast.
Or
And the
1 year.
shorter the forecast, the wider the range of outcomes. And in fact, it wouldn't give you meaningful information upon which to base a decision, because you'd be coming back every year, coming up with a new set of assumptions. And the assets are very long-term dated. And if you emphasize too much in the short term, by definition, what you'll do is reduce so much risk in the portfolio that the expected return of the portfolio will be dramatically lower than it is today, which in fact, I don't know that that's what a consensus of this board would reach. And the point of the exercise is we have no horse in the race. The point of the exercise is for you to argue how much emphasis do you want to put on that short-term versus long-term? How much emphasis do you want to put on risk versus return, depending on how you define risk? And reasonable people can look at that differently. But the point is to create a dialogue for you. And the ability of any one of these models to forecast the future is at best problematic. And that's why it's redone on a regular basis, not just by the investment side, but the actuarial side, which revisits it on a regular basis.
Tom?
Yeah, so this is really interesting to me. I don't really think, we've been talking about the model being our constraints, and I'm not really feeling that. I mean, I understand really well, I think, what the model is getting at, and I think it will be helpful for us to get a picture of our risk tolerance there. I think separately, a strategy about asset allocation, and the big constraint right now we're working with is the mins and maxes in different asset categories, and my reaction is that would be a separate discussion once we have a sense of our risk tolerance. So I'm pretty comfortable with this work. I'll be curious to see where we come out in terms of voting.
Yeah, I'm going to suggest that we go ahead and move forward. I just want to do a little time check. It's 12:30. So I did want to just sort of check in with the board and see.
Well, can I make a suggestion?
Yeah, sure.
In terms of logistics?
Yes.
Any other questions?
No,
Okay.
go.
You have a what we call a ballot. Looks like this. Do all of you have these? What we're going to do just for the first time around is have you fill these out sort of confidentially. So everybody's filling them out at the same time. No one's really influencing anybody else. It's just where you want to put your weight. We'll gather those from you. We'll load them up. Maybe while you're doing that, you could take a break.
Okay.
And when you come back, you'll see how it shakes out. And then we can dialogue from there. Does that sound like a reasonable plan?
Yes.
Yes, that
Okay.
does, sorry.
So go ahead and take These are just the decision factors here, and you're just deciding how much emphasis you want to place on 1, 2, 3, or 4.
You have 100%.
And you have 100 points to allocate. Some people in the past have chosen to put negative numbers in there. We would ask that you not put negative numbers in there. Maybe round it to
Decimal
5, just to keep it simple.
And I'll play Price Waterhouse, P. Mark, whoever it is, and collect the ballots.
And this one will be blind, right, Neil?
What do you mean?
No, that's not
Larry's
confidential.
writing.
Anonymous?
But they don't know.
Michael Wilson. Oh my gosh, you stole my good
And hold-
idea.
and we don't, I'm sorry, we don't know who's who.
I know we don't.
Hey, this is-
Fill them in. Whoops.
We don't know who's who.
Do we want to know who's who? I think we do.
No.
Well,
Neil, for the first one, I want it
Okay.
blind.
Neil, I've got,
okay.
Playing Harry today.
okay, I know, these names are all messed up.
Thank
and
you.
proposals. So I have a comment from, Ms. Dillon. You guys ready to come back?
Neil,
Neil,
Neil.
Hey,
I have a question for you. So, when we take a look at the voting process that you have proposed, sounds like we're only gonna run through this maybe 3 times. Can we read, scenes that Michael's new, Tom's new,
Right.
we also have Paul and Michael and Sharon that have not ever, and maybe even Rich, that have not ever run through this before. Can we do maybe more than 3 run-throughs?
we talked
Okay,
about
before
this.
we
We
come
can
up
do
to
as
our-
many as we
We can
want,
do
as
as
what
many
we
as you
discussed,
want.
right?
Yeah.
As many as the board wants, we can
Okay,
run different
cool.
scenarios, so.
I'm good.
So Bob is loading these now. It's going to take him a few minutes. So it's up to you whether or not you want to sit and look at my pretty face or take
I
a
wouldn't
break.
describe it that way.
One thing I want to add, if you remember his chart with the efficient frontier and where Rich was asking to move up, I have to say it's very interesting. Being a staff person, I have done this, as we've discussed, for Alan's probably done hundreds of these. We used to always have the discussion simply on the efficient frontier. We would show the board, we would talk about, I promised my daughter, she's watching because she's a math major, and I said we're going to talk about correlations and R-squareds and T-stats, and we used to. And I can tell you the board pushed back because they felt that was not real life. They preferred talking about, and that's where PCA came up with the idea of these decision factors. So it's very interesting, as in life, we go full circle. You would probably be more comfortable with the efficient frontier this time. It's in here. It will be in here, and you will be able to dial up and down. You do not have to have the decision factors driving. That's why I think once we load these and you can see, we can still dial up and down. The drawback with an efficient frontier, as we've discussed, is it measures risk in one number, standard deviation, and we know in life risk is not a single-digit number. And so that is part of the process. The other thing I'll bring up for the board, the new board members do not know, we spent the first half of this study from September through, about February, January, not looking at asset classes, but looking at the portfolio from a risk framework. In other words, what investments are linked to GDP growth? What investments are at risk with interest rates or at risk with leverage in the markets? And we looked at the portfolio that way. We still intend to come back. Once we've picked a traditional asset allocation framework, we will come back and look at the portfolio through that lens. I've often said it literally was like looking at a coin at another side. Very different picture, but still factual. But that will help us know, okay, what are the key risk factors to this portfolio? You know, before we said it's over 70% of this portfolio was impacted by global GDP growth. And the next largest was interest rates, and that will help us then determine more of your risk factor.
So
And
now
are
I'm
you
just gonna
done?
suggest, can we do a couple run-throughs and then break for lunch? Is that okay?
Sure.
We'll just do a couple scenarios. Is that all right with the board? You guys can hang in there for?
Following up on Chris's comment, I'd like to answer Mr. Zeiger's question a little bit more directly. And if you go to page INV 101, Oops. Here's your standard risk return, efficient frontier, with, there's 20 portfolios on the efficient frontier, and then you have your policy portfolio way over there on the right-hand side. And I apologize for the numbers being really small, but you're saying, find me the best returning portfolio subject to the risk being the same as my current policy, so I'll go up from the triangle, and find me that portfolio. So on this chart on INB 101, that is portfolio 18, just to highlight it for you. And it's what the implications of that are. You can see its risk number. The policy's expected risk number is a 13.8. Portfolio 18 is a 14. It's not right on top. Well, actually, it'd be portfolio 15. I'm sorry, that's 13.7, maybe somewhere between 15 and 16. So you can see what's happening there is you're dialing back your public equity. You're significantly reducing the fixed income, so same kind of theme as it's in the model. You're maxing out 13% apiece on private equity and real estate. And interestingly enough, you are making more allocations to the two functional classes, inflation sensitive and absolute return. So that answers your question directly of what portfolio is it that would be sitting above the triangle. It's portfolio 15 on INV 101.
The result of your,
100.
Given the way we have to vote, how do I get that?
Well, that goes to some of Alan's comments and Mr. Cohen's comments. Is this is a tool? It's not perfect, and and goes to Lawson's comments about we're gonna tweak it. So that's what the model's gonna produce some policy allocations, and you might dialogue about tweaking the numbers around a little bit.
well, the result of your votes are now up on the screen.
They're not tied to those
And
names
at
directly.
the end of the day,
Yeah.
Mr. Zeiger, I want to underscore this.
I want to delete them because I have to put them back.
You as a policymaker, you're not driven by what comes out of the machine. You can say, we like this, but we want to change it a little bit this way or that way. And there's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't do that if you think that's appropriate.
And just to
No,
We
it's
didn't
not.
put-
We don't have
we
any
didn't
names
put our
here.
names on it, so
I just
they're
did it in order.
randomly put them in there.
okay.
they're not tied to
I
your
had the
names.
same reaction.
Right.
Okay.
But lo and behold, Mr. Zeiger, this is very close to the portfolio that we were just talking about, if you look at it.
And so ignore the names, and you can see here that you have these here is sort of the aggregate, the average, average weight assigned by the board. 24% to one, about 9% to two, 28.3, and then 37.8. Slightly higher risk weight there, reflecting the fact that that's kind of, as you've pointed out, your one conservative tool. If you wanted to look at the
Now, if you were to sum 1, 2, and 3, which we all say are sort of return oriented.
Yeah.
That's 52, 61, 62. It's just about the same percentage we came up with 3 years ago.
That's a good point, although the factors are slightly different.
So
But can you guys make sure you plug in? Because I think with the mic, they want to make sure we get, so, go ahead, Rich.
okay, so if I want to see how mine did,
Sure.
because I may want to tweak it, right?
Yeah.
Because I've got in mind sort of how
can
I
do
want
that.
it to.
Yeah,
which
I
one
can do
is
that.
it?
you can do
No,
that.
I'm Tom.
We're gonna share all the.
Well,
Because mine's painfully obvious, right? I think there are only really two choices, and I'm riskier than my friend Paul. And so I had 20% on the conservative one and 80% on the riskier one. So what does that do? Where does that put me on the frontier?
as Bob's doing that you bring up a very good point, and this, in a sense, is a little bit of a game here. And if you want to have an influence on the game, which do you want to do? Do you want to spread your eggs across the basket, or do you want to concentrate on one factor because you know everybody else is betting on the other ones? So it's more interesting to maybe.
Okay, so have you now put it here? So I've come
Yes.
pretty close to guessing what I wanted to do, right?
Interestingly enough.
Looks like it might be a 95-5 maybe.
Madam Chair,
Okay.
Yeah,
with your
sorry, go ahead.
permission,
Interestingly enough, I think
I'm going to use a different word than Neil used, game.
game
And I would call it a process. And the reality is it's a process that allows you to specify what your priorities are and realize the potential impacts of those priorities, given these metrics.
So
And the
I agree
first,
with you, Alan. I'm not thinking of it as a game, but I am thinking of it as a process. Like, where do I want to be? If I've got a sort of a notion where I want to be, right, I just need to know what I need to do to move me there. It's not a game, it's just how do I move the process?
and
Alan,
so,
Yes, that's fair.
Can I jump in from the back row? So what I would encourage you to do is the board members that feel very strongly about either a higher risk or a lower risk portfolio to talk about that. Express your point of view, sway your fellow board members, vote again. And this time we can load the votes by a name so everybody can understand each other.
could we show,
Excuse me.
explain the result?
Go ahead, so, sorry. Go ahead, Tom.
So maybe the easier way to get to consensus here, since 1, 2, and 3 are essentially the same, with slight differences in asset allocation, is to think of just to bifurcate this, so you vote on 2 channels. A more aggressive,
The
less
red or
risk
the green?
tolerant, and the more risk tolerant level.
Do you mean like the red and the green, Tom, is that what you mean?
Yeah, that's a reasonable approach, although if you do go back and look at the extreme examples, there was an allocation difference, I think, 1 through 3, the range was 64% public equity versus low 50s.
Right.
So there is a range there,
Yeah, I think
but your point's well taken.
my thought is that that's sort of in the details of it, where we have to come to strategy about asset allocation. Specific asset allocation is a separate subject. One, because it's gonna take them some time to implement it. If we went from 64 to
Right.
50.
Right.
And it may not be practical, but I think the idea of, if we're thinking that we're 65% return-oriented and 1/3 risk-oriented, or 35% risk-oriented, I
Right.
think that's as good a picture as maybe you can get.
There's nothing wrong with that at all.
Yeah, I mean, the wild card being that 2 is really an aggressive investment strategy.
Or, I mean, you can do this right, you could just say, because 2 is so different between state contribution scenarios, maybe we're not gonna even use that one. Let's just use 1, 3, and 4. I mean, it's up to you.
Why not just, I think
Just
Tom's
use
idea is a
2.
great one, but let's just use 2.
That,
Well, in
that,
terms
it
of
just,
outcome, 1, 2, and 3 are almost identical.
Yeah.
Maybe the asset
So you're saying
allocation is
using
different,
2 and
but
4,
the-
you're saying using 2,
They'll weigh
3 and
1, 2, and 3 the same.
Well, you can, but.
I think it's, sometimes simpler is better. And I think a recommendation to make it simpler and just have 2 choices, and that way it doesn't appear, even though in substance it wouldn't be, is that you're trying to be more diversified, so you're going to vote more broadly. This allows there to be a cleaner decision between green and red. And I think that's a good choice.
So I'm just gonna remind, this is about risk tolerance for this board, and the suggestion that Tom made was to just basically have us vote between 3 and 4. How do people feel about that? We can do another round? Remember, this is a process, so we
Okay,
can
can-
try it
can
out
they
and see
vote
what we
now?
think. Can we
they
do that,
vote?
Bob, with your
Or do we have to
setup?
enter it?
Can we
No.
do
Oh.
just 3 and 4, and
Sure.
will it spit out what we need in terms of our the asset
Okay,
allocation?
let me just do one thing here. Did somebody write down where this came up? I don't know, I haven't been saving as we've been going along.
Don't have it on tape, don't worry, Bob.
Don't worry about it? Okay,
We'll have it on videotape.
Everything's on video.
all right, great.
Not perfect.
Okay, so we're looking at, and whose name do I replace for Dana Dillon here?
Nobody.
She's
I'm
there.
here.
Oh, I beg your pardon.
Why don't we just go down the list and is that
I
okay?
think we have everyone that's
Okay.
here, so we're all set with the names.
So,
So do we want to have you guys verbalize your weightings on 3 and 4 then?
I was able to add my 4 together, yeah.
Okay.
You did your 3 and 4?
Madam Chair, the benefit of doing it verbally is that you really put on the table where people's priorities are and allows you to discuss the policy differences. The first time I ever did this was at CalPERS, and all the employers voted 100% for minimizing the volatility of costs, and all the employees group voted for maximum returns because over there it has an impact upon benefits. And that created a level of discussion which resulted in a very, very healthy dialogue. And that's the purpose of this exercise.
And as a reminder, the 2009, it was 60/40 return
Growth,
versus.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
6%
But
free.
but that's sort of a different question, I think. Maybe not.
Well, I
Well-
was just thinking of the
Yeah.
rate, anyway.
Just
So you guys
keep in
wanna
mind
vote?
that, that's right, Sharon.
All your columns and start again.
That's right, Sharon, but the decision factors were somewhat different.
Okay,
But the theme that's common between the two was the 60/40.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, but let's just do the exercise,
Yeah.
if we can, quickly, because time is at a
Can
premium.
we just start down
Okay.
with you, Frank?
50/50. Okay, I'm sorry, I don't,
He's gonna be Bill
So
Lockyer.
he's Bill Lockyer.
Well, we could go by name, then just
Oh,
call it
yeah,
out.
so Dana?
And it's
Okay.
better, and it's,
That's better.
Bob, it's better to go top to bottom, so we
Yep.
give you what our number 3 is, and then we go back and do our number 4.
I think you just
Fill 'em
go,
in this way.
just go down the
Alright,
list, Bob.
so
Dana
45,
45?
yep.
and,
So it's 45/55.
Right.
Terry,
Right.
you're
yep,
next.
that's all you have. Yep,
Terry,
Terry?
you're next.
Sorry. 60?
40.
I'm 50.
50?
I'm 25/75.
30/70.
Pardon?
30/70. Just to be different.
Yeah.
And that's you, Frank.
Paul?
Oh, I thought it was.
35,
Oh, sorry, my bad.
This is turning out dramatically different. I'm 90/10.
This is good to do it verbally.
No, that's what
He's
it
just
was.
shifting the score back.
And I'm going to 85/15. Having had the luxury of
That is
seeing what my
real.
last one
And
was.
Bob, I said mine backwards, so I'm 55/45. I'm sorry.
This is
Very
when
tough.
where recounts are allowed.
No hanging chads. Interesting. Yeah, that's close to what I was, that's actually close to exactly what I was thinking.
You notice what you've got is almost the same expected return, but at much less risk because of the change in assumption.
So interesting. That's
Now that, I mean, I don't know, because I haven't tested that, but if you spread that 3 across 1 and 2, you might get something different. I mean, that's very different from what you had before, and it's different from the scenarios that we saw because you're using just those 2 factors. So I'll just say it for the sake of saying it, that might not be the right way to do it. I mean, if that's how you want to
You're saying
express.
it might not be the right way to do it, to just do 3 and 4, is what you're saying?
I'm just saying that for the point of saying it. Look, the allocation that you have, that's, at the end of the day, that's your allocation. But it is very different from policy. I mean, you're going to 40, you're dropping public equity by 7%. Fixed income, that's consistent across, no matter how you pick them. Real estate's maxing out, private equity's maxing out, and then you are almost maxing out on the 2 other classes, that's a diversified portfolio.
Right. What you've come up with there is completely intuitive when you look at the assumptions that went into the model. And that is what it did, it solved for the best diversifying asset classes. And the more diversification you have, the better you deal with volatility.
I just want to change the screen for a second here. And you'll notice that it makes no difference at all, and it really, it has a slight reduction in the probability of pay-go up to about year 20 or so, and then it's identical thereafter, which isn't too much of a surprise, seeing that ultimately the lack of
Can you
contributions,
get returns?
yes, just drives everything. And you can see that that the level of return, the median return, doesn't change that much after the first year, but in each case, the best portfolio selected has slightly less variation.
I've got a couple folks in line here. Terry?
Thank you. I just like to test and check certain things, so I would just like to see what the asset allocation is if you copy the percentages in column 3 and move them to column 1, and then column 4 to column 2, and just make sure just like to see if there's any change in the asset allocation.
Between 4 and 2.
53
No.
on 1 and 47 on 2,
Yeah.
Terry?
Yeah,
Yeah, 2 and
Okay.
3.
yes.
It's gonna be different.
Right, but let's,
Let's do it,
That's-
but we can do it.
So 2 and 4 have no relationship whatsoever to each other.
Like so?
Yeah, it's different.
But yeah.
So now you're increasing,
That's the
you're increasing
column
public
three and four,
equity by
yeah.
1%.
Oh, whoa,
No.
yeah, wait, I haven't
no,
done
you
this
gotta
one.
you gotta put zero out the other two.
It's a process, it's a process.
He was levering your portfolio.
So now
Inefficient
now
frontier.
that is more, to use the term, that is more aggressive. I mean, you're wiping the slate clean on your two, the inflation sensitive class and absolute return, and you're loading up on public equity even more.
See, that's why I'm a little concerned about simplifying this,
Yeah.
because I thought that we would see something very different, and I think I'd like to see using all 4 decision factors instead of just simplifying it to 2.
Can we keep 4 the same and change 3 to 1?
Yeah.
Because switching 4 and 2 are not identical, so we're obviously gonna get a huge
Yeah.
difference.
Yep.
The question is whether switching from 3 to 1. Right.
Yes, that's correct.
I'm leaving 4 the same.
Okay, but this is
Three and
exactly
two
what
is
the
irrelevant.
process is supposed to do.
And now you're right back where you were.
Well, that's more similar, although it is more similar to the prior one, but it is different than the prior one.
It mostly affected the absolute return.
I was just gonna say, I can't.
Yeah,
they're very
it basically put money from absolute return, which was at 6% before, and it put it into public equity.
Okay, hang on. Paul?
I'm sorry? Well, yeah, I mean, I think whether we get there by weighting number 1 53% or number 3 53%, we get pretty close to the same outcome.
Well, I mean, there's a big difference between a 2%, I mean, you're right, and probably all the analytics, the returns are the same, but the allocations, I mean, is there?
I understand that. I understand the allocations are different, but
Yeah.
I don't care about the allocations. I care about the returns. So what you're showing is 2 different allocations that get us to the same returns and get us to the same place on the efficient frontier. So I think what's interesting to me is that whether we have it between 1 and 4 or 3 and 4, this, close to 50-50 split, not exactly, keeps our return where our current portfolio would get us, but reduces our risk. So that seems like a pretty good outcome.
It's actually
And we can debate whether we should do it with, the allocation that we get from 3 or allocation that we get from 1. And quite frankly, I'm indifferent because we're getting to the same outcomes. And I don't care about the portfolio allocation itself, I care about the outcomes. But I think that's getting us in a direction that makes some pretty good sense for this board. But these are outcomes over 10 years, right? In both cases, we're doing returns and standard deviation.
It's on the chart there?
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Great, thanks. Tom?
So let me be the first to say, simplifying, it turned out not to be that great an idea.
That's okay, that's all good.
But,
Process.
Well, it's still simple, it's just simple on 1 and 4 instead
yeah,
of 3 and 4.
it tended to draw, it's interesting to me that it tended to draw weight towards the more conservative allocation. The other thing that it strikes me is that while, to Paul's point, and this is why I'm a little concerned about mixing subjects here, to Paul's point that the returns are the same, when you look at where our money goes and the ease at which we can implement those higher returns by being higher in inflation-sensitive assets, absolute return, and private equity versus public equity, I really wonder whether we've not added significantly to the degree of difficulty in getting those returns. And that's really a question for Chris.